The interview no one expected. Melania silenced the host live. On the night it all happened, no one in the Chicago studio could have predicted what was coming. The David Sinclair Show, known for its provocative approach and biting humor, was just another late-night show on American television. But that night something felt different. The tension backstage was palpable. The production crew whispered among themselves, the lights were adjusted with unusual care, and even the opening music seemed heavier. David, smiling as always, opened the show with a nearly theatrical energy. "Tonight," he said, "you're going to witness something unexpected." The audience laughed, relaxed, unaware that in just a few seconds, laughter would give way to absolute silence. Then he said the name, Melania Trump. For a moment time stopped. The audience froze. Some murmured, others exchanged incredulous glances. There was no immediate applause. Just a thick suspense, as if everyone was trying to confirm they had heard correctly. And then she entered. With steady steps, a direct gaze, no smile, but no hesitation either. Melania crossed the stage like someone who knows exactly where she is and why she's there. She sat across from David Sinclair as if the environment were familiar, even though it was clearly hostile. That night, on a stage set for provocation and spectacle, her presence was not just unexpected. It was a challenge. And no one, not even the host, was prepared for what would come next. Based on a broadcast that divided a nation and united an idea, the interview began almost cordially. David Sinclair, still wearing his usual smile, asked light questions about fashion, philanthropy, and life after the White House. Melania responded politely with a firm and calm voice. Nothing seemed out of place, yet. But it only took a few minutes for the subtlety to dissolve. "Do you miss the visibility you had as First Lady?" David asked with a suggestive look. The question, seemingly harmless, carried a hint of poison. Melania, unmoved, replied, "Visibility was never my ambition. I preferred to work in silence." The audience murmured. The game was on. David continued, now with a hint of sarcasm in his tone. "Some say that this silent work was convenient. That you chose silence when the world demanded a stance. What would you say to those people?" Melania looked directly at him. "I would say that noise is not the same as courage. And that dignity sometimes speaks in a quieter voice." The tension in the studio rose. David, still smiling, was now clenching his teeth. The audience, once relaxed, began paying closer attention. The cameras captured reactions of surprise and a certain unease. It was clear that David had expected to face a hesitant woman, perhaps fragile in the face of scrutiny. But what he encountered was a solid presence, responding with calmness, never raising her voice, never losing control. And that composure was more powerful than any fiery speech. Little by little, the provocations began to bounce back. And Melania, who had entered as a target, began to subvert expectations with the quiet strength of someone who knows exactly what she represents, and doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. As the interview progressed, David dropped any pretense of neutrality. His tone was now direct, almost ruthless. He knew the audience expected a clash, and he decided to deliver just that. 4 years you were at the center of power. But you stayed silent. You didn't comment on policy, didn't condemn excesses. Was that loyalty or convenience? Melania did not look away. It was discernment. There's a difference between being complicit and choosing the right moment to speak. I chose silence when words would have just added to the noise. The audience went silent. It was as if her answer had shaken something, perhaps David's very strategy. But he didn't back down. "Some people say you were just a symbol. A decorative presence next to a controversial man. Did that image never bother you? Images deceive. So do words." "But time reveals everything," she replied, with the calm of someone in no rush to convince. David then went further. He hit the most delicate point. "You knew what you were doing when you married Donald Trump. Wasn't it obvious that man would bring chaos? At any point, did you regret it?" The studio went still. Not even a breath. The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. All eyes turned to Melania. David leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the impact. She, however, didn't answer immediately. She let the silence grow. She simply took a deep breath and held his gaze. There was no tension in her posture, only firmness. It was the opposite of the spectacle David wanted. While he tried to provoke a breakdown, she offered restraint. While he bet on confrontation, she cultivated clarity. And, without anyone noticing, the control of the interview slowly began to change hands. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What began as a game of sharp questions had turned into a battle of presence, of poise, of control. David Sinclair, used to dominating his guests with irony and ambiguity, now faced an unexpected opponent. Melania didn't dodge, nor did she ignite. She responded with a calmness that slowly disarmed him. But David wasn't ready to back down. He knew he needed a final blow. Something definitive. He leaned forward like someone who had been saving a question for years, waiting for the exact moment to use it. "Melania," he said in a lower, deeper voice. "With complete honesty, have you ever regretted marrying Donald Trump?" The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the cameraman dared breathe too loudly. The question was an abyss. There was no way to answer without consequences. It was the kind of question that could become a global headline, echo for weeks, maybe months. Melania remained silent for a few seconds. She looked straight at David. Then she scanned the audience with her eyes. There was no fear on her face. Only a clarity that few possess when under pressure. Then finally she answered, "Regret is for those who don't take responsibility for their choices. I made mine, with open eyes, and I continue to make it every day. That's called integrity." For a moment no one reacted. It was as if the words were still being processed, absorbed. Then, almost in unison, the audience rose in applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was recognition, relief, catharsis. David leaned back in his chair. For the first time he seemed speechless. His eyes revealed surprise, perhaps even admiration, though disguised. The interview, which he had controlled until then, now belonged to her. At that moment it became clear. Melania hadn't come there to defend herself. She had come to affirm who she was. And the world, all of it, was listening. The studio erupted in applause. It was as if a field of tension had finally burst. The audience, once torn between skepticism and curiosity, now stood in respect. Shouts of support, whistles, and clapping echoed across the stage. It wasn't just about the answer, it was about how it was delivered. Without shouting, without attacking, without justifying. Just with conviction. David Sinclair remained silent. He tried to smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He had set the stage to expose fragility but ended up revealing a strength he hadn't expected. The spotlights were still on him, but they no longer belonged to him. Melania, on the other hand, didn't celebrate. She simply stayed seated, composed, looking straight ahead. She didn't feed off victory, she simply remained steady as if she had known the outcome all along. The show ended with the applause still echoing, and her image becoming the final frame of the live broadcast. But the real impact came afterward. Minutes after the broadcast ended, clips began spreading across social media. The snippet of her response went viral at lightning speed. Journalists began reacting in real time. Melania silences Sinclair with elegance. The answer that redefined an image, when composure beat the spectacle. These were just a few of the headlines that took over phone screens and news tickers. Backstage, producers and reporters exchanged glances, aware they had just witnessed something rare. Not just a remarkable interview but a complete reversal of expectations. David, now calmer, commented off-air, "She played on another level, and she won." Melania left the studio in silence, without giving statements. Her exit was as powerful as her presence. No theatrical goodbyes, no rehearsed smiles. Just a firm step toward the door, while the world outside was already reacting. The confrontation was over, and against all odds she was the one who had set the rules. In the days that followed, the interview dominated the news cycle. TV programs, podcasts, opinion columns, everyone analyzed every word, every gesture, every second of silence. But, interestingly, the moment that resonated most was the one where Melania said nothing as she left the studio. A silence that said everything. David Sinclair, long used to being the center of attention, was the first to acknowledge the impact. In a post published the next morning, he wrote, "I underestimated a woman who, in silence, has been shaping her own narrative for years. Last night, she simply allowed us to hear it." The statement was widely shared, seen as a rare gesture of humility from someone so sharp. The episode sparked a national debate. Not just about Melania but about the limits of journalistic provocation, about how we judge silence, about what strength really means. For some, she had redeemed herself. For others, she had finally revealed herself. But for the majority, one thing was undeniable. She had taken a stand, and with that, shifted collective perception. In schools, newsrooms, and dinner tables, the interview became a topic of conversation. Because it wasn't just about politics or marriage or fame. It was about dignity. About facing judgment with firmness, without shouting, without fleeing, without bending. By the end of that night, one thing was clear. Sometimes power isn't in saying a lot, but in saying the essential at the exact right moment. And if you've made it this far, maybe you're also wondering, how many times have you been judged for what you didn't say? And more importantly, how many times was your silence stronger than any answer? And so, with one answer, one silence, and one direct gaze, Melania Trump didn't just respond to a question. She wrote a new chapter in her own story. Not with scandal, not with attack, but with something rare: self-awareness. In that studio in Chicago, in front of hungry cameras and a host expecting a misstep, she offered no shield, no escape. She offered a mirror. And those who looked closely saw something beyond the former First Lady, beyond the public figure. They saw a woman who, when faced with judgment, chose not to explain, but to stand firm. The world applauded. But she didn't wait for applause. She was already at the door. Perhaps that is true power, leaving the stage at your peak, not out of vanity but out of mastery. And while many are still debating the interview, what she meant, what she implied, Melania Trump has already moved on. Without carrying trophies, without seeking redemption. Just with the certainty of someone who no longer needs to prove anything, not to others, not to herself. Because in the end, the stage doesn't belong to those who speak the loudest, but to those who know when it's time to stop talking. And let the world in silence reflect.